Hey guys, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I'm back today with another story for you. If you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. And if you have any other video ideas, you can let me know in the comments. And on to today's topic. So I already did a video about Billy the Kid and whether he died in 1881 or whether it was really a cover-up. And we didn't get into a lot of the details on one of the people that has claimed to be Billy the Kid or did claim to be Billy the Kid before he died. And there is a lot of details to go over about this gentleman for people to really make a opinion about things. So I thought I would do another narration video about this gentleman. And this gentleman that we're talking about is Oliver Brushy Bill Roberts. And he had said he was Billy the Kid around, I believe it was 1948 or so. And I believe he died around 1950. So anyhow, he was around for a couple of years. He provided a lot of details. But there's a lot of details that really do seem to point to this Brushy Bill Roberts as actually being Billy the Kid or having a pretty strong possibility that he may have been. So we're going to go over some of those details. But to do so, we have to understand where this part of the story started, because it almost seems like he may have not come out with this story at all if it wasn't for a certain sequence of events. And we're going to talk about that sequence of events, and then we're going to talk about some of the evidence that points to him, potentially being Billy the Kid, after we go over the story. So it starts like this. In 1948, William V. Morrison was a probate investigator. He was working in St. Louis, Missouri. He was sent to Florida to work on the case of an elderly man named Joe Hines. Hines claimed that the land of his recently deceased brother now belonged entirely to him, since he was the only surviving heir. And while Morrison and Hines talked, Hines admitted that he was actually Jesse Evans, who, after he'd been released from prison in Texas in 1882, he disappeared. So Hines then told Morrison of his experiences in the Lincoln County War and with Billy the Kid, and this held special interest for Morrison because he was related to the Maxwell family of Fort Sumner. And when Maxwell proclaimed to Hines that Billy the Kid met his death at the hands of Sheriff Pat Garrett in a house of one of his relatives, he was shocked that Hines replied that Billy the Kid was not killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett or anyone else for that matter, and he was still alive. And Hines went on to say that besides himself and Billy, there's only one other surviving veteran of the Lincoln County War, and his name was Jim McDaniels. So, and Jim McDaniels was a member of the Jesse Evans gang. So he was part of the gang, and anyhow, so further intrigued, Morrison then probes Hines a little more for Billy the Kid's current name and address, because obviously he's not going by his real name or even any name he had back then. So Hines gives Billy's current name as Oliver or Ollie L. Brushy Bill Roberts, and gave his address as Hamilton, Texas. So several months later, after completing the Hines case and everything, then Morrison struck up a written correspondence with Brushy Bill. And throughout the early correspondence, Morrison was careful that he didn't reveal what Hines had told him about his true identity. So at this point, Morrison attempts to track down Jim Daniels, and that proved to be an impossible feat. So he managed to track him as far as Round Rock, Texas, but the townsfolk there said that he moved away in 1945 to live out the rest of his days with his daughter in California. So Morrison then gave up on the McDaniels angle, and he wrote to Brushy Bill again and told him he would like to meet him. So Brushy agreed, and in June of 1949, Morrison came and he visited his small little shack in Hamilton, Texas. And in his journal, Morrison wrote down a lot of details. He noted that Brushy Bill was about 5 foot 8 inches tall. He weighed about 165 pounds. He had blue eyes, small hands, large wrists, heavy shoulders, thinning gray hair, high forehead, prominent nose, and large ears. So Brushy invited Morrison inside and introduced him to his wife Melinda, and Morrison wasted no time and asked Brushy Bill whether he was Billy the Kid, to which he denied at that point, saying his half brother living in Mexico was the real Billy the Kid. So, somewhat disappointed, Morrison decides to leave, but he asks Brushy if he may possibly be able to take a trip to Mexico someday soon to interview his brother. So on the way out the door, Brushy stopped Morrison and told him to come back in the afternoon of the next day when his wife would be out visiting a friend and they would have the house to themselves. So Morrison did this, and he returned the following day, and Brushy admitted to him then that he truly was Billy the Kid, only he didn't want to say so in front of his wife. So Brushy then went on to say that he knew he didn't have many years left, and he wanted to die with a full pardon, and he had been promised by Governor Lew Wallace back in 1879. So Morrison said that he would help the old man with his case, but only if he could be shown more proof that Brushy was who he claimed to be. At this request, Brushy took off his clothes and exposed 26 bullet and knife scars on his body, several matching known locations of wounds on Billy the Kid. Brushy also demonstrated the ability to, in a kind of double-jointed move, make his hands smaller than his wrists, which the real Billy the Kid was known to do in order to slide handcuffs off. So, believing at this point that Brushy could be the real deal, Morrison promised him he would do all that he could to help him obtain a pardon, provided Brushy would allow him to investigate further into the history and to find more proof that he was authentic. So Brushy agreed, and the two parted company that day. So over the next several months, Morrison met with Brushy Bill several times and recorded his story, and he recorded it in his journal and on a tape recorder, and all the while they made sure that Mrs. Roberts was kept in the dark or away at the times that they were meeting and discussing things. So Brushy didn't want his wife to learn his true identity and maybe be disgusted with him for his reputation. So, in a nutshell, this is what Brushy said his story was actually like. He said he was born William Henry Roberts on December 31, 1859, in an area of Texas known as Buffalo Gap. His parents were James H. and Mary Adeline Roberts. Mary Roberts died in 1862 while his father James was off fighting with Quantrill in the Civil War. He said that Catherine McCarty was not his mother, but his maternal half-aunt. After his mother died, Brushy went to live with Catherine and her son Joe. But since Brushy was so young and Catherine moved around so much, everybody just assumed that Brushy was actually Catherine's son. So, fearing that Brushy's father might try to take him back, she covered her tracks and gave him the name Henry McCarty, and that became one of his aliases. When Brushy told of his days as Billy the Kid from 1877 to 1881, Morrison really determined that Brushy knew way too much about the history of Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War to have just read about it. Several things that Brushy had told Morrison, though at first glance may have seemed trivial, actually were very important, as few people, historians included, knew of them. When it came to the events of the night of July 14th, 1881, Brushy said that a man named Billy Barlow was killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett. Barlow, he said, was partially Mexican and had a beard and looked a lot like the kid, but was a little younger than than himself. And he said he was possibly related to the Clements family, the cousins of John Wesley Hardin. Brushy also said that he doubted Billy Barlow was the man's real name. So after Barlow was killed, Brushy continued, he fled Fort Sumter. Fort Sumner. After fleeing Sumner, his story went like this. He lived in Mexico with a tribe of Yaqui Indians for 2 years, and then he returned to the U.S. and worked in Carlton, Texas. And he continued to move around a lot. He changed his name multiple times. He was married 4 different times, used a dozen different aliases, and things clouded up a bit at that point as he tried to seek employment. But I guess every time he sought some new employment, it sounds like he may have changed his name just to distance himself from his past. So in 1949, Morrison did take Brushy to New Mexico for the purpose of having him verify some details on his claim. So Morrison had been given Billy's, remaining acquaintances by other respected historians, and so they stopped and they were able to visit some of these other friends from his past. And they also visited the courthouse in Lincoln, New Mexico. And Brushy detailed to Morrison how he, as Billy the Kid, made his famous escape and killed deputies Bob Olinger and James Bell. By the time they completed their trip and returned to Brushy's home in Hico, Texas, where he had moved in the summer of '49, they had managed to meet some of his friends from back in those days, Severo Gallegos, Martil Abel, Jose Montoya, and Bill and Sam Jones. The first 3 all signed legal affidavits attesting that Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid, and the Jones brothers, although they didn't sign affidavits because they didn't want to be involved in the proceedings, they stated they also agreed that he was Billy the Kid. So at this point, Morrison is taking Brushy Bill to New Mexico to work on getting his pardon with Governor Mabry at the time, and it was supposed to be a secret meeting, and when they got into the governor's mansion, there was tons of media there taking pictures and all kinds of stuff, and it totally caught Brushy off guard. And it was said at that point that Brushy had like a mini stroke, and he didn't feel well. He couldn't answer their questions, and he had to go lay down. And then the governor, of course, then didn't believe that he was Billy the Kid, and he dismissed everything. And Brushy Bill went back to New Mexico, or back to Texas from New Mexico, and his story ends pretty shortly after that. On December 27th of 1950, Brushy had left his bed. He had told his wife he was finally feeling a little bit better, and his wife said she needed to mail a package, and Brushy said he would walk it down to the post office. And as he walked down the street, Brushy suffered a sudden heart attack, and he fell to the ground and died instantly. So that was the end of Brushy Bill, but that wasn't the end of all of these details and these recordings and all these journals and all this stuff that Morrison had written down. So he had all this stuff recorded and written down, and they could go through and try to verify some of these things that they wouldn't be able to talk to him about again. So we'll go over some of those details now. So Brushy Bill's knowledge of the Lincoln County War and the life of Billy the Kid was too extensive, for him to have just read about it. For example, he knew that Colonel Dudley's soldiers that entered Lincoln on July 19th of 1878 were all black. He knew all the details of how the Kid had to pay his lawyer for the services in his trial. He knew that Billy the Kid wrote a letter to Governor Wallace proclaiming his innocence and murder of James Carlisle. And he knew exactly how the McSween house was set up before it was burned. In 1949, Morrison had took Brushy Bill to the old Lincoln courthouse, which also served as the Murphy Dolan Riley store. And in the building, Brushy described how the building looked during the kids' incarceration there, everything to a T. Every little detail of how the building looked. And he said how when he killed Bell, one of the guards that he killed first, the first bullet hit the wall and then ricocheted into Bell's side, which is true, but which wasn't well known at the time. In Brushy's possessions, he had a very old scarf that he claimed that he had gotten from Delovina Maxwell after he was captured at Stinking Springs, and he was brought to Fort Sumner. He said he gave Delovina the tintype of himself and she gave him the scarf. This really did happen, but the only posse member, Jim East, knew of it, and he only spoke of it later when he wrote to fellow lawman Charlie Siringo. Brushy said that when he went to trial, his first indictment was for the murder of Buckshot Roberts, and he was represented by Ira Leonard. He also said that Leonard was able to get the case thrown out. This is true, but very, very few researchers knew of this back during the time of Brushy Bill making this claim. Cervero Gallegos, Jose Montoya, Martel Abel, and they were all surviving friends of Billy the Kid, and they had met with Brushy Bill all separately, and they had all talked to him, and they all agreed that he was Billy the Kid. And they signed affidavits, like we already kind of mentioned about that. So we already know also that Jesse Evans or Joe Hines had said that, that Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid and told him where to find him and everything. Bob Young, a native of Round Rock, Texas, had visited Hamilton, Texas in 1930 and first met Brushy Bill. The two became friends, and Brushy informed Young that he would like to accompany him on a return to Round Rock, Texas. But when the time came for Young to return home, Brushy regretfully said he couldn't accompany him since his wife was sick. Still, Brushy asked Bob Young to look up an old friend of his, Jimmy McDaniels, a former member of the Jesse Evans gang and veteran of the Lincoln County War. He told him to look him up, and he told him he lived in Round Rock, Texas. So Brushy went on to tell Young that when he found McDaniels to simply tell him, "The kid says hello." And when Young returned and he met with McDaniels and delivered Brushy's message, upon hearing this, the old man looked as if he had been badly frightened, is what the report had said. So one day in the 1940s, Brushy was walking down the street in Hico, Texas, and as he was walking down the street on the side of the street, there was a 5-year-old boy and his mother, and the boy ran into the street and almost got hit by a car, and the mother yelled out to her son really loudly, "Billy!" And witnesses said that Brushy whirled around and reached for an imaginary pistol really quick. After Brushy realized his name wasn't being called, he hurried away. Although it's not technically evidence of the claim, it does indicate that he was a man used to danger. Another day in 1945, Brushy was walking down a Hico street, and an old lawman named Henry Anthony and his sons were also on the street. And when Anthony saw Brushy, he jumped up and yelled at Brushy, calling him Billy Bonnie. And he told him to throw up his hands. And when his sons calmed him down, Anthony said that Brushy Bill was Billy the Kid, and he swore for the rest of his life that Brushy was the Kid. In 1990, the famous tintype of Billy the Kid, and also a purported photo of the kid at age 12, and a photo of Brushy at age 14, and a photo of Brushy at age 90 were all analyzed in this Acton-Bovic photo study. The study used the most advanced photo comparison equipment around, as well as the best scientists. The photo purported to be 12-year-old Billy the Kid was determined to not be him. The photo of 14-year-old Brushy was a close match to the tintype, and the photo Brushy at age 90 had a 93% match to the famous tintype that we know as Billy the Kid. And they stated the missing 7% can be explained due to age and dental work and so on. And like we mentioned earlier, Brushy Bill had each and every scar that Billy the Kid was said to have, and even more. So these were a lot of the details that have led people to believe that Brushy Bill, or Oliver Brushy Bill Roberts, actually was Billy the Kid. They claim he knew way too many things in too much detail, and some of those details maybe came out in other records in more recent times, but at the times he reported certain things, it appeared very few people knew or could verify certain things he was saying until much later after he had been dead for many years. So we should probably also go over what Brushy Bill Roberts, or Billy the Kid, said about what happened on the night that Billy the Kid was supposedly killed. So this was the account that Brushy Bill Roberts gave of that night. He said he was riding from a nearby dance with a new friend, a young man that was new to the area named Billy Barlow. And they rode into Fort Sumner shortly before midnight, and he said he had heard rumors that Sheriff Pat Garrett was in town with a posse, and Billy the Kid and Barlow went to the house of Jesus Silva, a good friend of Billy the Kid's. So when the kid started asking Silva what he knows about Sheriff Pat Garrett being in town, Silva gets excited and tells him he should probably leave town immediately and not be spotted by Pat Garrett. So the kid shrugs off the warning, however, believing he will be safe as long as he stays at the Silvas and he doesn't venture out to the house of the Gutierrezes, which he suspects that the sheriff will be watching. So Silva begins to cook a meal of beans for Billy the Kid and Barlow, and when Barlow asks for some fresh meat, Silva says that he has no beef, but that there is a freshly slaughtered cow at the Maxwell house that's hanging there, and if one of them will go cut some beef and bring it back, he'll gladly cook it up. So Billy the Kid is content to go without the meat, but Barlow was not. So Barlow grabbed a knife and he walks out the door, and although the kid is sensing a trap or doesn't feel it's safe, he tries to talk Barlow out of it. Well, a few moments later, Billy the Kid and Silva hear a couple of shots from the direction of the Maxwell house not far away. So the kid grabs his pistols and he runs out of Silva's towards the Maxwell house. And he rushes through the gate of the Maxwell's yard and he begins firing his guns at the lawmen's shadows. So suddenly a bullet hits Billy in the lower left jaw, knocking out a tooth as it strikes him. And turning around, another bullet hit him in the back of the left shoulder. So he was able to jump back over the fence at that point, and said that a third bullet kind of creased his forehead a little bit. So despite his wounds, Billy manages to make it back over the fence and crawls to the house of a Mexican woman who takes him in and bandages his wounds. And later that evening, Celsa Gutierrez enters the Mexican woman's house and tells Billy that Garrett has killed Barlow and that the body is being passed off as Billy the Kid's. And so he says Garrett undoubtedly knows he's killed the wrong man, and he also knows he can't admit to it. And since Barlow, he can't admit to it because Barlow is not a wanted outlaw. He was new in town and wasn't wanted. So whereas he said the killings of Tom Folliard and Charlie Baudry were also cases of mistaken identity, but both of those men were wanted outlaws anyway. But Barlow's just an innocent civilian. So with this situation, Billy knows he must leave Sumner for good, and he basically lets the authorities think that he's dead or whatever. And so at 3 a.m., Billy and a friend, Francisco Lobato, saddle up and they rode out of Sumner to a nearby sheep camp. And for the next few days, Billy will stay at various friends' sheep camps as he heads south towards Mexico. With the law and the enemies believing him dead, Billy takes on many different aliases and changes his names many times over the following years, and then leads a adventurous life, but leaves his old life behind. So that is what Brushy Bill said happened on that night, and why there was a cover up, and how he wasn't actually dead at that point. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but that's the overall story of Brushy Bill Roberts, and how at the end of his life he claimed to be Billy the Kid, and how he seemed to have a lot of evidence that proved that maybe he really was. One other thing we should probably go over is some of the false evidence that was against Brushy. Certain things like supposedly he wasn't literate, and this comes from a book written by author C.L. Sonichson, and he had even stated afterwards that he regretted the way that he had mentioned this, and he didn't mean to say that Brushy was illiterate, but he said he meant to say that Brushy was not a literacy man, meaning not one to sit around and read a bunch of books and stuff like that. And the illiteracy thing really snowballed, where a lot of people think Brushy couldn't read and write. And in fact, Morrison stated Brushy had many journals that he kept, and that appeared to be a false claim there. It was also said that Brushy was left-handed and Billy was right-handed, when in fact they were both known to be ambidextrous and could shoot and write with either hand. It was also said that Brushy couldn't speak Spanish and Billy was fluent in Spanish, but Morrison stated that he saw this firsthand when he took Brushy to see Severo Gallegos. Brushy spoke with Severo's neighbor, Josephine Sanchez, in perfect Spanish, and many others stated that he spoke fluent Spanish and even signed affidavits attesting to this. So Brushy said that he used the name of a cousin, Oliver Roberts, that had died years earlier, and he said he assumed his name later. And Oliver Roberts was born August 26th of 1879 in eastern Texas. If Brushy was him all along and was never Billy the Kid, then how did he come upon all of this specific knowledge that Billy the Kid would only have? Like the Lincoln County War and all these details that he knew. This would have all taken place before he was even born in 1879. And also, if he was Oliver and never Billy, then how would he have done the things he said he did after fleeing Fort Sumner? Many of these details have been proven via documentation and personal effects that he's had in his possession. And if Brushy was not Billy the Kid, then why didn't he adopt some of the more normal details, of the birth date that was well understood? And wouldn't you adopt everything to try to match everything up instead of to make some more questions arise? Why wouldn't Brushy say he was born in New York City and he was born as William Henry McCarty and that Catherine was his mother? Wouldn't he say all those things if he was just trying to make everyone totally believe he was Billy the Kid? So some of that doesn't really make sense. It makes more sense if you really are Billy the Kid and there's a few things people don't know and you're trying to set the record straight instead of just trying to pretend to be someone that you're not. You probably also wouldn't say Catherine was your half-aunt. You would say that she was your mother. So a lot of these details shed some questions on things there too. One other question I had going through things was, at first I had this big question about how someone could pretend to be Billy the Kid, who I believed had firm baptism records in New York City from September 28th of 1859. And with Brushy, he said he was born in Texas in December of 1859. So this concerned me, as it seemed like possible proof that he wasn't Billy. But the more I researched things and dug into things, the more questions I came up with this situation. And it made me wonder if the McCartys in New York City, who also showed an older daughter, Bridget, in some of the records, I wondered if they were even the right McCartys. And I believe the baptism showed the name as Patrick Henry McCarty, not William Henry. And in this case, where would the name Billy come from? Also, not much is known about his father, because his father supposedly died shortly after Billy's brother Joseph was born. So there are a lot of researchers that believe that Billy's father was a man named Michael, and that the McCartys that we are speaking about that have some records in New York City are not the same as Billy's family. I believe they also said that Catherine in those documents was a couple years difference in age to Billy's Catherine. And I believe that came from census or baptism documents or both. Another thing that lends some credence to some details that Brushy has said is that there is an author, Philip Rash, that wrote Trailing Billy the Kid, and he had done a lot of research, and he had said in the 1950s that everyone, all the older people he talked to around Silver City, New Mexico, knew that Billy was an illegitimate child. And William Antrim, Billy's stepfather, always tried to change the subject when his family or anyone brought up that topic. And Rash said, I am convinced that there is some scandal in her, meaning Catherine's, past. And could this be that she was hiding the fact that Billy was not even her son, as Brushy Bill said? That could be a possibility. Also, if Billy the Kid was illegitimate, then it appears that the baptism record in New York City for Patrick Henry McCarty, two parents, Catherine and Patrick McCarty, may not be him. If he's illegitimate, then how does he get a baptism just a few days after he's born that says that the parents are married and everything? So I look at this as a possibility that what Brushy Bill said could totally be true, and maybe he was born in Texas, and if so, and if his mother died in 1862 while his father was fighting in the Civil War, then Billy would have been about 3 years old when Catherine left with him. And I don't know if she went to New York City or Indianapolis at that point, but at that point when she left, and that would be probably around the time that Joseph was born. Maybe Joseph was born, maybe the next year or so. So maybe she moved, and it could be that, that Joseph may have been illegitimate also. We don't really know for sure. But anyhow, we know that Joseph was born around this time, and it could be that maybe Catherine was widowed in Texas and then left for greener pastures, with Billy and Joseph, or maybe pregnant with Joseph or something. We don't know for sure on that, but that leaves a few questions there. There was also a Catherine McCarty at age 17 that arrived on a ship called the Devonshire from Liverpool, England, and she came to escape the Irish famine. And the date that this ship arrived in New York City was April 10th of 1846, and she's listed as a servant. So it could be that if this is Billy's mother or half-aunt Catherine, it appears that she's the right age according to these documents. But her name is already McCarty, and it doesn't appear that she was married at age 17, and it could be that she's on this ship and maybe she was an indentured servant to someone that paid her fare to come across the ocean with them, and she may have had to serve some time serving as the family servant before she possibly joined family somewhere else, possibly Texas or whatever. But this is many years before Billy was born, I think about 13 years before Billy's birth, so there's plenty of time for her to work in New York City for a family as a servant and then still make her way to Texas after that if, it was a situation where, like Brushy said, Billy's real mother, Brushy's real mother, had, an aunt that was this Catherine, or a half aunt. So these are all some questions that still arise with things. So still hard to say. That Catherine could be Billy's Catherine and could have been a half aunt to his real mother who could have taken off with him, or it could be a situation where that Catherine that came over on the boat eventually had Billy in New York City and his brother Joseph, and then gradually moved across the country and had no connection with Texas. So we don't really know, but there are those are a few things that came up where people have a few different facts that they believe one way that weren't entirely true and didn't discount Brushy's story. So I don't know what your thoughts are about some of those things, but you can let me know.